Thanks everyone for joining us for this session. Hope your day is going well and there's nice weather wherever you are. Excited to speak to all of you about some of the work that we've been doing. This talk is going to be about shifting from equality to equity through responsible data use. And I'm Kaushik Mohan. I'm a data scientist at the Data Clinic. So just getting started. So Data Clinic is part of Two Sigma, which is a financial sciences company. So unlike typical companies in this space, majority of the employees of Two Sigma are data scientists and engineers. And a few of these employees about 7 years ago started the Data Clinic, which is modeled similar to a legal clinic in that we provide pro bono data science and engineering support to nonprofits, government agencies, and academic institutions. And these are typically projects ranging from 4 to 6 months long, and they're staffed by Two Sigma employees who volunteer their time to work on these projects. So today's talk is going to be about a few of our projects, particularly aligning with the theme of today's talk around shifting from equality to equity. So any conversation around equality and equity typically starts with a visualization like this. So equality is about providing equal resources to everyone, whereas equity is about providing resources proportional to the needs. So in today's talk, we're going to try and interpret this in the context of data science and data analysis. Unfortunately, typically a lot of the headlines around equity and challenges in the data science world are related to AI and machine learning algorithms being racially biased or gender biased. And a lot of the talk around equity is concentrated around these worlds of black box models and machine learning algorithms. But the question of equity and thinking about equity isn't by any means restricted to work in that space. In fact, we think about equity in our social impact work all the time. And how we'd like to think about it is in over the course of a pipeline of a project. So starting with the data. Once again, a lot of the conversation around building equity in data science centers around the data. There's this idea that if you have bad data, the outcomes from any analysis that you do might be bad as well. So if there are biases in the data, then your analysis is going to be biased, which is one thing. But it's not by any means the only thing that contributes to inequity in social impact work. Next comes approach. So once you have the data and you want to analyze it, you apply a particular approach to this. And once again, there's this notion that algorithms are bad and there are things that could go wrong with it. While algorithms necessarily need not be biased, how they are used and how they are applied in a particular context can propagate any biases that exist in the data. And lastly comes the application. And this is not something that's spoken about a lot, but it's extremely important to think about how the work that you're doing is applied in the real world and how people are using it, because there is a lot of room for inequities to creep in there. So we're going to try and think about equity challenges in data science through the lens of the data science pipeline shown here. But the question of equity isn't just about these things. So these are particular parts of the process, but providing an equity lens and thinking about data analysis through an equity lens is all about the people. So taking into account the people involved in each of these processes. So starting with the data, some of the key questions that we want to raise, and I hope to raise over the course of this presentation, is about who's represented in the data and who are the people involved. What are we analyzing? Who are we analyzing? What is our population of interest? And when we think about approach in a similar context, we are thinking about what are we optimizing for in any approach that we take, and how does this impact different segments of population or different groups of interest. And lastly, when we think about application in the context of this equity lens and thinking about people, we want to think about questions like, who are we reaching with this work? How are we communicating our work to the people that we want to target? So these are just some of the questions that we'll try to address in today's session. All right, so starting with some of our work that we've done, and I want to show these, talk about equity and think about equity lens through the lens of some of our projects. So starting with our project with the Vera Institute of Justice, where we help them summarize data through an equity lens for their policy research work. So Vera Institute of Justice is an amazing nonprofit which works on criminal justice reform through their data science research and advocacy work. And one particular area of research that they were interested in is understanding how policing practices based on 911 call data might differ across different cities in the US. So this is something that they were interested in because 911 calls form an important part of policing work in the country. And they came to us with a project to try and understand the landscape of data available on 911 calls across the country, and try and bring all of these data sets together to try and make sense and inform research on enforcement and response policies across different cities. So before we go into some of the analysis, one of the first questions we started to think about here was to define what the population is. So this is 911 data from different cities, and we're going to look at one particular city here, New Orleans, Louisiana. And one of the first things we can do is say, okay, we can find where these calls originated from and try and see how this is spread across the city. So the chart here has the call distribution. So this is calls per capita for an average year across New Orleans, with the purple colors being low numbers and the yellows and greens being higher values. And from this chart, we can see that, okay, there are some neighborhoods which have a large call density, some others have fairly low call density. And just by looking at this, we might think, okay, maybe this is proportionate to population, where there are more people, you might expect a lot more calls to 911. But what we see is actually almost exactly the opposite, where the regions which had a large number of calls per capita actually turned out to be the parts of the city which are least populated. So this is where there are not many people living here, but then there's a lot of calls being made. So there's a question of what's the right population to consider? Is this potentially a question of residential population versus daytime population and so on? And even defining what the population here is can be quite challenging. All right, so let's dig in a little bit more into this data. So who's involved when a 911 call is being placed? So there's a person who's placing the call, and this can be either initiated by a member of the public, or it could be initiated by the officer. And these are slightly different. But these are not the only people involved when a 911 call is placed, but this is the only information that's available in an open data sets that's published by these cities. The other key population that we're interested in at the end of the day when we are thinking about research, and particularly research focused on informing policy, is what is the underlying population in the neighborhood where the call originated? Because any policing practices, end of the day, are impacting the population living there and population in the underlying neighborhood. And here we are not just talking about numbers in terms of population, but it's also important to recognize different demographic and economic characteristics of these neighborhoods. So we'll look at one particular example of this. So here on this chart, we're looking at calls of suspicious behavior. So this is a fairly common call type that we see in 911 data across different cities. And here we're looking at the percentage of all the calls which were of type suspicious behavior. And we're comparing this across two different subgroups. So the bar on the left represents census tracts across New Orleans with the lowest percentage of white residents in the city, while the bar on the right represents census tracts with the highest percentage of white residents in the city. So here we're looking essentially at predominantly white neighborhoods versus predominantly minority neighborhoods. And we see at the outset that the percentage of calls of suspicious behavior are very similar. So roughly 5% of all the calls coming from these neighborhoods are across both these neighborhoods are of suspicious behavior. So just looking at aggregate stats at this level, we might say that there's not much difference, between different neighborhoods across the city in terms of this particular type of call. But digging into it a little bit further, we see that there's big differences when it comes to looking at what proportion of these are initiated by members of the public versus what proportion of these are initiated by officers policing in those neighborhoods. With nearly like more than twice as many calls being initiated by officers in predominantly white neighborhoods. And this is at the initiation phase of a 911 call. We can also look at what the outcome is at the end of the day, where we see once again that enforcement activity. So this is where a responding officer is taking some action based on this call is also vastly different across these two different neighborhoods across New Orleans, with nearly more than 50% of calls in predominantly white neighborhoods having some form of enforcement by the police responding. So this shows us that, while at the outset we might see in terms of aggregate stats that things don't look very different across different parts of the city, digging into it a little bit deeper provides a lot more context and insight into sort of the different behaviors and different things and patterns that might be happening across the city, particularly when comparing against demographic and economic characteristics. So applying this sort of idea to this project, while Vera was primarily interested in generating a bunch of aggregate stats and insights around the number of 911 calls, the different call types, and what the outcomes are across different cities to compare and analyze what might be different, what might be similar. As we started digging into this data and mapping these 911 calls to the origin and examining the different statistics, particularly along community characteristics. So finding what the correlations of some of these are with demographic factors and economic factors, we were able to help inform research and policy by identifying these different correlations that exist and disparities that exist even within a city, let alone across cities. And we feel that it's extremely important to try and understand what the underlying population is and how these might be associated with different statistics that you're analyzing. So something as as one of the first steps that you would do in terms of generating summary statistics is also important to sort of account for different underlying populations and different underlying characteristics, particularly with respect to demographic and economic characteristics. All right, so this is the sort of first level of work with respect to the data and some of the things that we should be considering when looking at any sort of data that we're analyzing. The next comes the approach that we're taking. And here I'm going to talk about the project that we did a couple of years ago with the Robin Hood Learning and Technology Fund, where we helped them develop an equitable approach to identifying partner schools. So Robin Hood is a nonprofit that's based in New York City, which primarily works on poverty alleviation. But they also have a fund called the Learning and Technology Fund, which aims to provide technology interventions and resources to particularly low-income schools in New York City. And they consider about 1,400 schools across the city in the K through 8 ranges. And they have a few filtering criteria. So they want to target schools where most of the students are considered to be below poverty, which is a proxy for which is whether they receive free or reduced price lunch. And they want to target schools with a majority of the students being minority students, so greater than 50% of the students being Black or Hispanic. Apart from these two filtering criteria, they also have a criteria based on proficiency. So proficiency is something that is published by the New York City DOE, Department of Education, which talks about what the scores of all the students in the school are in the standardized tests that they conduct each year, and based on the scores, they define whether a student is proficient or not. And overall, they publish a proficiency number for the school. So what percentage of students can be considered proficient? And here, Robinhood, the Robinhood L&T fund, was looking at schools which perform between 30 to 60%, or roughly near the city average. And the reason for this is they want to target schools which are somewhere in the middle, in the sense that they don't want to target schools which are performing really well because they might not need these additional interventions, and they're able to provide adequate resources to the students already. And they don't want to potentially partner with schools which are already struggling because they might not have the capacity at this moment to accept any new interventions. So they want to look at schools that are performing somewhere in the middle. And what this led to was very interesting because using this sort of approach of a threshold between 30 and 60%, it led to a lot of schools potentially being eliminated from having a partnership with the L&T fund. So they came to us and said, hey, we are doing this, but it feels like we are missing out on a lot of schools. So can we help tweak this approach and improve this approach so that we don't eliminate as many promising schools and identify more schools that we could potentially partner with? So as we started sort of looking into this and using data from the New York City DOE, one of the first questions we wanted to investigate is why would this be happening? Why are potentially a lot of schools being eliminated through this approach? And what we found was that unfortunately, proficiency as a measure is highly correlated with a lot of things. So the chart here shows the distribution of proficiency levels for schools on the x-axis, separated by different subgroups in terms of minority. So the topmost chart has the distribution of proficiency for schools where over 90% of students are minority students. And as you go lower down at the bottom, we see only about 50 or 60% of students are minority students. And what we can almost immediately see from this is going from top to bottom, the distribution of proficiency is gradually shifting to the right. And what this means in terms of a cutoff for the L&T fund is having a proficiency range that they target between 30 and 60% leads to a decreased likelihood that a school which is high poverty or high minority not being considered for a potential partnership. And here I'm showing a chart of proficiency with percentage of students being minority, but a similar chart holds for poverty rates as well. So we see that some of these demographic and economic characteristics are highly correlated with proficiency levels, which is why the current approach is eliminating a lot of schools from potential partnerships. So how can we think about resolving this? So one way we try to do this is by trying to decorrelate the performance from all of these correlated characteristics. So we do this using linear regression. So we try to model the proficiency levels of a school based on all of the characteristics and context of the school that we have available. So we know what the demographic composition is. We know the number of students who are receiving free or reduced lunch. We know how many students are English language learners and so on. And what we find is extremely striking. We find that nearly 70% of the differences in schools' performances can be explained by these socio-demographic variables alone. And that is like, it's a lot. This is like phenomenal in the sense that there's such a high correlation between just demographics and the performance levels of a school. And I want to point out here that this is correlation. So these are correlations between proficiency levels and these socio-demographic variables. We can think of these as, a lot of these socio-demographic variables represent are like proxies for a lot of different things. Particularly, these are proxies for structural inequities that have existed for a long time. For example, schools might not be receiving the same level of resources as everyone. There are several things that have contributed to these sort of differences in performance, such as segregations in schools, districting, the access to opportunity in terms of, say, teachers and principals and so on. So these socio-demographic variables are acting as a proxy for a lot of things underlying, particularly in terms of structural inequities that exist in society, unfortunately. So once we've sort of done this linear regression and tried to understand the scale and the extent of these correlations, what we aimed to do was to try and tease out all of these correlations out from the performance. So can we look at performance after accounting for all of these other things that exist, all of these other correlations that exist? And this is where the sort of unexplained bucket comes in. So the 25% of the differences in schools' performance, we cannot explain using the data that is available. And this is essentially the what is remaining after we take out all of these other factors into account. And we can think of this in a modeling sense as the residuals, where we look at the actual school performance, so how the school actually performed in a given year. And based on the model that we constructed, which takes into account all of these correlations, we can predict the performance of a school. So this is how we would predict that a school perform given all of these characteristics based on what we know about the global averages in terms of correlations with characteristics and performance. So this is the predicted school's performance given all of these characteristics from the model. And when we subtract these two variables, what we're left with is the residual from the model. So this is essentially what is capturing the things that are unexplained in the model. And this tells us that after accounting for all of the characteristics that we use to build the model on, this is how much the school over or underperformed these predictions. And these come in extremely handy because now instead of looking at the school performance directly, which has so many things that it is correlated with, we can instead look at residuals, which is taking out all of these factors that we can model that are correlated with performance. This is best illustrated through an example. So based on the residuals, we can identify schools which are overperforming with respect to the predictions. And one such example is the Frederick Douglass Academy. So Frederick Douglass Academy had 26% of students proficient in 2018. And by the original approach, this school wouldn't be considered for a potential partnership because it has less than 30% of students being proficient. But when we compare the school's performance against 30 more similar schools to it in terms of the characteristics that we have available about schools, we see that Frederick Douglass Academy actually does better than 83% of schools that it is similar to. So in some sense, the residuals that we are getting from the model is capturing something. And all of this unexplained differences in performance that we have from the model is essentially capturing something that's going on which we can't explain using data. And a school such as this is actually doing something that is allowing it to perform better than other schools that it is similar to. And therefore, we are able to identify more such schools through this approach that we otherwise wouldn't have. So what this means in terms of the chart that I showed you before, again, looking at proficiency against different buckets of minority groups for schools, is the original proficiency threshold between 30 to 60% was selecting about 241 schools for potential partnership for the Robinhood L&T fund. But once we take into account the correlations and tease out the residuals from the model, we are able to improve this by more than 50%. So we are able to identify 106 more schools that might be potential partners for the fund, simply by using this idea of how the school is performing relative to what we would predict based on the model and based on the correlations that exist in the data. And what's even more important to recognize here is that majority of these schools that we are identifying are in the high poverty or high minority bucket. So we are able to identify schools that otherwise had the least chance of being identified for a partnership, selected for the partnership by tweaking our approach to think about performance of a school not as a whole, but thinking about performance of a school relative to its context and relative to its characteristics and composition. So just to summarize this section here, what it meant to apply an equity lens to this project is going from applying a universal threshold to identify schools to using data that we have and trying to understand what the correlations that exist in the data are, and trying to decorrelate the outcome variable that we're looking at, in this case, performance, to identify what is left at the end, which gives us a good idea of how schools are performing relative to other schools with similar characteristics. And this idea of relative performance or relative overperformance allows us to identify a lot more schools, particularly the high poverty, high minority ones, for partnership with the Learning and Tech Fund. All right. So next up, we looked at the approach to the data to begin with, and now we just looked at the approach and how we can think about approach through an equity lens. The last project that I want to talk about here has to do with the application. And here I'm going to talk about our partnership with the Nashville Metro Arts, where we help them build a strategy for ensuring equitable access to arts programming. So Nashville Metro Arts is the Commission of Arts and Culture for Nashville. And they do a whole bunch of things which can be sort of categorized into three main threads. So they primarily provide funding and resources to organizations to conduct in-school and after-school arts programs in the city. Apart from that, they also fund local artists and public art installations across the city. And lastly, provide operational grants and support to cultural organizations that involve residents across Nashville. And they've been doing this for over 30 years now, and they've been collecting a bunch of interesting data over the last 5 years. And they came to us with the question of how do we use the data that we've collected to help develop a strategy so that we can ensure everyone in Nashville has access, equitable access to creative life. And we'll see why this is an important question for them, because over the last 30 years, the number of organizations that Nashville Metro Arts or NMA has funded has increased, going from less than 20 organizations in 89, 90 to over 70 organizations in 2018. But the amount of funding that they have has stayed relatively flat over this last decade. So as you can see, that right from around 2002 or 2003, the amount of funding compared to what they have now in 2018 has stayed relatively the same, which means that as the number of organizations has kept increasing, the amount of funding they have being the same means they're not able to provide the organizations with how much they used to, and they're having to make critical decisions in terms of which organizations to prioritize and how to allocate their funding resources given all of this context. And this is where the question of how to do this equitably comes in, because it's important to recognize that the funding that they provide goes towards involving residents across the city, and it's important that they do this in an equitable way so that each dollar that they provide goes towards everyone in Nashville equitably. So in this project, one of the first questions we started thinking about was how should equitable access even be defined? So what does that even mean? We can think of equitable access across different dimensions. So we can think of demographic access. So are people across different racial ethnic groups receiving access proportional to their needs in terms of these programs? We can look at this through a socioeconomic lens. So we can look at this through income. So are people across different income levels receiving equal access to these programs? Or we can look at this through a lens of geography. So across the city, can anyone living in any part of the city able to access these programs that NMA funds? And we can do this if we have an understanding of, okay, who's actually participating in these programs. If we have information about that, we would be able to say, okay, what are the gaps? What are the differences that exist? But we don't have this information. We don't know exactly who's participating. So we need to think about a sort of different approach to this. And we can do this through a couple of means. So first is we know where these programs are located across Nashville. So here's a map of Nashville with the locations of all the different programs that Nashville Metro Arts funds, with schools that they serve marked in yellow, public art installations in orange, and the funded projects and organizations in teal. And we see that this is scattered, all across the city. But even a quick glimpse shows us that there are probably denser areas and less dense areas. And these might be potentially proportional to population. And that is what we want to get at, trying to understand what these are. So we want to get an understanding of what the underlying population across the city is and compare, where these initiatives are located across the city and what can we understand given these locations and given the underlying population. So we try to think of this process of trying to understand equitable access and build a strategy through 3 steps. So the first step is to try and understand how the grantees that NMA funds are doing. So here we take an example of the schools that they're serving. So in this chart, we're looking at the distribution of schools by the number of students disaggregated by different racial or ethnic groups, where the orange boxes represent all of the schools in Nashville, while the green boxes represent just the schools that the grantees that NMA funds are supporting. The reason why we want to do this is to compare what the differences between these are. How does an average school that NMA supports different from an average school in Nashville overall? And we see that the averages are fairly similar, but there are some differences as well. In particular, we see that the grantees of NMA actually support a wider range of Hispanic schools. So an average school that NMA supports has a larger proportion of Hispanic student population than an average school in Nashville. And we can see this by a larger variance, a larger average, and so on. But the same is not true when we look at the non-Hispanic Black students in Nashville, where the schools that are supported by these initiatives form a very, very small part of all the schools in Nashville and the distribution of Black students in all the schools in Nashville. In particular, we see that while the averages here might be the same, the variance is much lower. In particular, we can look at some of the largest schools in Nashville in terms of Black student population, but there are only very, very few organizations which support some of these schools here. So this gives us a picture of or understanding of how NMA is doing currently, so that we can next build up to, what can we do better? So here I want to show an example through the lens of public art, where on the map here on the left, we see the underlying non-Hispanic Black population in Nashville, particularly the proportion of Black population across different parts of Nashville, with the greens and yellows representing higher proportions and the blues and the purples representing lower proportions. And the white dots on there are the public art installations across the city. And we can immediately see that a large part of the Black population in Nashville is concentrated in the northwest part of the city. And we see that there are not too many art installations in these neighborhoods, with majority of public art highly concentrated in the center, which is the downtown part of the city, and a few more in the southwest or the northeast parts. We see something similar when we also look at the proportion of Hispanic population across different parts of the city. Once again, similar scale for the chart. And we see that most of the Hispanic folks in Nashville are living in the southeast parts of the city. And overall, we can see that Southeast Nashville has just a denser minority population, but doesn't have as many public art installations as other parts of the city. So looking at this through a geographic lens can immediately help us identify where the gaps are in terms of where our current initiatives located versus where the underlying population is located. And very visually, we can identify where the gaps might be. So lastly, the next question of importance for Nashville, of course, is we know how we are currently doing. We know what the gaps are. So how does Nashville Metro Arts now, improve their reach? And this is where we're taking the example of funded projects. So funded projects are programs that are run by organizations across the entire city, and these are typically located in public spaces, such as parks or senior centers or at colleges, libraries, and so on. And these are located all across the city, and what we can easily try and decipher is, given the locations of these facilities across different parts of the city, which are the facilities that have the greatest access to the population of interest? So we can look at the vicinity of all of these locations and find the average proportion of population, particularly in this case, across different racial and ethnic groups, and try and compare what the averages across different facilities look like, or different locations look like. And we are able to notice that locations such as libraries and nonprofit facilities and Metro Nashville public schools and community centers have the greatest access to this, to a much more diverse audiences. And targeting efforts and organizing events and initiatives at these public spaces might enable Nashville Metro Arts to increase their the diversity of their reach much quicker than trying to concentrate on some of the other locations across the city. So to summarize all of this, so this is still a work in progress, and we're hoping to complete this project very, very soon. Some of the insights that we are collating to provide to Nashville Metro Arts are identifying schools that they can expand their programming at, and identifying new schools which contain more underserved communities and target more underserved communities where they could initiate new programs at. With respect to their public art initiatives, we are helping them identify public spaces, once again, in some of the key neighborhoods that I showed a couple of slides back, which might be potentially good locations for public art installations. And lastly, when it comes to their overall funding, we want to help them supplement their current approach through data. So by providing data and insights into the different locations and what the potential reach is and how this can be disaggregated by different demographic and economic characteristics, we're hoping to help them make these difficult decisions about how to fund different projects while keeping in mind the larger goal of equity across their work, hopefully a little bit easier, aided by this data. So just to summarize once again what the overall process looked like, currently Nashville Metro Arts allocates funds to a host of projects and initiatives through a qualitative review of applications. And by using data and mapping these different locations and using census data to understand who might be more easily able to access these given the locations, we are able to provide them with quantitative context to supplement their qualitative work, to help them better prioritize and identify organizations which target underserved communities a lot better, and thereby helping them sort of modify their process here in terms of their application with an equity lens and sort of having the larger goal of equity in mind. So overall, through these three examples, we've seen very, very specific things that we did to build equity into the work for these organizations, and making a lot of their work and building strategies more equity driven. But I don't want to talk only about the specifics. I want to hopefully leave you here with a lot of more general insights and questions that you could ask of your own work that you can take to hopefully make your work more equity driven. So some of the things that I want to mention here and list out, and this is by no means exhaustive, is with respect to data, it's important to understand how data is collected, what the process is, where there might be biases that creep in this process. It's important to understand who is represented in this data in the end, and whether this data represents your target population and where the gaps there might be. Other useful questions might be to try and validate whether you're measuring what you hope to measure from the data that you're collecting, and things such as whether you have the right to use the data to inform your work, particularly when it comes to data about people. With respect to the approaches that you're employing in your work, it's once again, I cannot emphasize this enough. It's really critical to evaluate whether the approach that you're using is suitable for everyone. We see across all the different projects that we've done, socio-demographic variables in particular are highly correlated with a whole host of outcomes in society. And this is an unfortunate consequence of the history of structural inequities that exist. So it's extremely important that any approach you take is validated to ensure that it is suitable for use for different subgroups in your population of interest. It's also important to consider the implications of your work. So by choosing what to optimize on, who is impacted by these approaches. And it's naturally important to ensure that the work that you're doing stays robust over time, over geography, and so on. And lastly, once again, one of the key things to recognize when we are doing data science work in a social context is to recognize the limitations. Especially in social impact work, we unfortunately do not have a lot of data that we might need to account for a lot of different things. There's several different limitations that exist with the data that is available that we can use. So it's important to recognize what these limitations mean in your work. At the same time, ensuring that the work that you're doing is interpretable at the end of the day. And lastly, coming to application, we talked about understanding how accessible your work is. Alongside it comes the question of how the work is being communicated. Is everyone able to access this work equally, given different contexts and different circumstances, and how they might use this work is important to understand. And this is where feedback is very important. So it's in any application of your work, it's important to have an inclusive feedback loop so that the population that you wish to target end of the day has some is able to provide you with feedback and context into the effectiveness of your work. And this is where some of the other prior work that has been done comes in as well, where we want to continuously learn from the work that others have done, that we ourselves have done, so that we don't repeat any mistakes as we go forward. And like I mentioned, these are just some of the larger questions that we hope you would take away in sort of thinking about your own work. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. But apart from these three parts of the data science pipeline, there's one very critical aspect that is often not spoken about enough or not mentioned enough, and that is the people that are doing this work. So diversity in work comes from diversity within your team. So it's important that the decision makers, the folks who are collecting the data and analyzing the data and implementing your work represent the folks that you are targeting as well. It's important that diversity and equity comes from within first, as well as in the work that you do. So it's always important to keep that in mind and take that into account in all the work that's being done. We are by no means the only group that is thinking about this. There are some amazing useful resources that we have found. One particular one is the 7-step framework by We All Count, which has really amazing resources around thinking about equity in data science work across even earlier parts of the pipeline with respect to framing the questions of research and how to think about design and process. The Urban Institute also has some amazing resources through their Elevate Data for Equity project, which you should definitely check out. Lastly, if any of this work that we presented here sounds interesting to you, we would definitely love to work with you and learn more. You can reach out to us through our email or through our website, and you can check out our other work at our GitHub or our Medium blog. And thank you.